Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of presentations in conjunction with Menas. My name's Andrew Grant. I'm a partner at Clyde Co and the head of political risk and trade credit. And I have the easy job today just to welcome everyone. It's great to see many faces that I know, but equally to see many that I don't. And the size of the audience, I think, reflects on the importance, obviously, of the topic, the nature of the speaker, Patrick Smith from Africa Confidential. Noel, the chairman of Menas, is going to introduce Patrick, so I won't dwell on that at the moment. I'd just like to just do a little bit of information about Clyde Co for those who perhaps don't know us. We are a truly global firm across the world in now 32 different offices in 6 continents with 1,400 lawyers. It really reflects the nature of our client base, where our clients have gone. We have also gone to partner with them in many jurisdictions around the world. I'm not going to go through every single business line, you'll be pleased to know, but our core sectors that we like to think that we are one of the preeminent firms in the world involve aviation, commercial, corporate energy, global governance, finance, infrastructure, insurance and reinsurance, as many will know, is a key sector for us. Projects and construction, professional practices, shipping, which is where our roots started, but we have grown to a much bigger firm outside of just the marine world, and trade and commodities. So we reflect, I think, and looking at the people on the list of acceptances, these are all the things that you do. We are forever expanding. We have just opened up in Beijing. We were the first Western law firm to be licensed in China, in Shanghai, in 2006, having been in Hong Kong since 1981. We've got 16 partners in China with about 50 lawyers. So our expansion there, as China grows, we're growing. We've just opened in Spain, in Madrid, which also services as a platform the South American countries. We've been intrepid and gone into Tripoli. It wasn't me. But we have a presence and a footprint there, and in Tanzania, in Africa. These are the contacts, the people in the team. On the subject of West Africa, I was looking at a map of West Africa, and the countries I've actually been involved in there: Nigeria, Equatorial Guinea, Mali, and the rest. It's a fertile area for us, but obviously Patrick will be able to deal with, in some detail, with what's going on there. Nigeria's issues, the Chinese investment, Nigeria's sort of war against Boko Haram now, and everything else, Mali, French intervention. It should be fascinating. There'll be questions at the end, and I think Patrick wants to have enough time. We are scheduled to finish at 10, so hopefully there'll be time for questions at the end. Now, with my IT incompetence, I'm going to try and get Patrick's. Yes, it works. No.
Good morning. Welcome to this briefing by Patrick, organised by Menas and Clyde Co. For those that don't know Menas Associates, we were founded around 1978. There are 2 parts to Menas. We produce monthly and weekly publications, mostly on the Middle East and African countries. And we also do consultancy, bespoke consultancy, looking at long-term economic and political risk, due diligence, etc., on a range of countries. But again, more recently, we found that whilst a few years ago the focus was very much on the Middle East, it's very much moved to Africa today. We also have a Menas Borders, which again which is really how Menas began, and that does the sort of non-legal research into border issues, and has worked on a number of borders in Africa and in the Middle East, and all Libya's borders. For example, Menas worked on the Libyan side of those borders, and we did Bahrain, Qatar, and Israel, Egypt, and Taba, and a number of other issues around the world. However, that's enough on Menas. I think, judging by the turnout today, I don't think I need to spend much time in introducing Patrick Smith, well known for his work for Africa Confidential. influential, and as a commentator on Africa over many years, and perhaps the outstanding, I would say, expert on African affairs. I'm delighted that someone who's worked with us for a number of years is able to give this presentation today. Patrick.
Thank you. Great. Well, thanks very much for turning out. I'll try to make it as varied as possible. I think from what I understand, you're interested in getting a sense of the dynamics in the region and some details about specific countries, Nigeria and Ghana and Mali and Côte d'Ivoire in particular. So I'll start off by just giving some thoughts about what I think are the big regional trends. And the first thing I wanted to raise was this issue of resource competition. And that's really in the with the backdrop of the BRICS summit in South Africa. And I think it was one of the South African activists who pointed it up as a kind of 21st century Congress of Berlin. That seems a little far-fetched, but on one level. Another level, I think it, for the content of the meeting itself, it may not have been that important, but as a sign that the future growth and prosperity of two continents is going to be based on that relationship across the Indian Ocean. It was a really, really strong sign. And you know, you've just got the statistics. 40% of the world's people combined domestic product of over $15 trillion, $280 billion of foreign direct investment, $50 billion development institution being planned to rival the World Bank, putting together a $100 billion currency reserve fund to rival the IMF. Just those figures give you a sense of what's being planned. Yes, those institutions aren't going to get set up tomorrow. I think the currency reserve fund is in the process of being set up, and the development bank will take some years, and the politics of where to base it. South Africa is going to be one of the favored locations for the headquarters, but I think it gives you an indication of the significance of this relationship and the economic weight. Now, I think the importance for West Africa is where it fits in, and certainly Nigeria is, as the leading country in West Africa and the second biggest economy in the continent, is thinking very hard about that. That was just a snapshot of what was going on in Europe at the same week. Cyprus bailouts, French intervention in Mali hits problems, and already there's a backlash in French politics about the wisdom of and the nature of the French intervention. So what you've got is you've got the BRICS summit down in South Africa, and these strengthening relations between Asia, South America, and Africa. At the same time, you've got this certainly a lot of questioning by European powers about their relationship with Africa, and it's actually quite a mutual questioning. Some say it's a bad marriage, and you know, are both partners seeking legal separation? It seems a strange thing that Europe at the moment is so engrossed in its own internal economic problems that it's not really playing much of a role in Africa. Yet in terms of geography and in terms of history, it would make much more sense if it was more engaged. There's a reference there to Fabius, the French foreign minister, and that gets to this European dilemma over policy in Africa. Within the French government, there's clearly a difference of opinion about the seriousness and the intent of this intervention. Fabius was of the faction that wanted quick, rapid fix and then out. That's clearly not the case. And as I said in an earlier slide, many of the French intellectuals are talking about a new Afghanistan in Mali. It depends very much how it's handled. There's certainly an argument that pressing for early elections is not the smartest thing to do when the security of the country hasn't been secured. Another thing that was going on in Europe at the time was this dispute in the London High Courts about two British oil companies, Heritage and Tullow, going on. And I think again that points to this concern in, oops, pardon me, still around, points to this concern in Europe about the new legislation. You've got Dodd-Frank's in the States, and you've got the new European Union regulations over declarations of state monies being paid by companies to states, trying to set up an international system of rules and regulations competing with a new axis of continents and companies that are not part of that. And I think it's something very, very important to watch. So you've got the Western companies subscribing or trying to set up this new system of due diligence and accountability, while you've got a new set of relations between Africa and Asia and Latin America that doesn't seem to be so susceptible to those new rules. So there's another complication in the relationship. As I said, it just appeared that week. It just seemed to be one of those weeks. You've got this big meeting in Africa and big talk about the new relationship with Asia, very much fueled by China, of course. And you've got again a government in the United States which doesn't seem that engaged at all with Africa. As an indication, the Assistant Secretary of State, the outgoing Assistant Secretary of State for Africa, Johnny Carson, very experienced diplomat, still hasn't been replaced 6 months into Obama's administration. Obama just yesterday, I think, announced, and if you'd got Africa Confidential a couple of weeks ago, you would have known exactly what he was talking about, because we knew it before he announced it, that he is going to Senegal, Tanzania, and South Africa, but not to Kenya, because he doesn't want to shake hands with Uhuru Kenyatta publicly because of the ICC issue. And I think this sort of the weakness of the European and American engagement tells us a lot about what role the traditional partners are seeing in this headlong rise of the African economies. I think it's an important sign. That's the dynamics of the BRICS club. Of course, China is very much the ballast to that. 4.4 trillion foreign reserves, half of them are coming from China. And South Africa itself just represents 2.5% of the club. But South Africa very much is the signifier for Africa. Now, there was a lot of concern about relations between Nigeria and South Africa. There'd been a number of political disputes over Côte d'Ivoire, the interventions in Côte d'Ivoire, and the interventions in Libya, where the Nigerian government, successive Nigerian governments, had taken the side of the interveners, of the Western powers on the Security Council, pro-intervention Libya, pro-intervention Côte d'Ivoire, and South Africa had been staunchly against those interventions, and that seemed to produce this diplomatic and also commercial consular rift between South Africa and Nigeria. Beginning of this month, President Jonathan was in Cape Town, spoke to President Zuma, and they very much seemed to bury the hatchet. And perhaps because of their internal challenges, shall we say, they both seemed to think it made good sense to appear to be good diplomats and statesmen on the continental scene. And that seems, and the big rift between the two countries seems to have been healed over. I think the other important thing to know there is that if you look at the structure of the Nigerian economy and these efforts by the economists this year to rebase the economy, that's to sort of recalculate the fundamental structure, how much in services, how much in agriculture, manufacturing, and so on. That hasn't been done for 20 years. And the assumption is when those figures come out, the Nigerian economy will be more or less level pegging with South Africa's economy. And the likes of Goldman Sachs and Renaissance Capital are saying that within 2 years, Nigeria's economy is actually going to outpace South Africa's economy. That's in terms of overall GDP. It doesn't mean to say that the average Nigerian will live as well as the average South African, but it means that as an economy like China, it will be, it will have a lot of weight and a lot of people. It's got almost 3 times over 3 times the population of South Africa. So I think it makes eminent sense for that sort of diplomatic rapprochement to come on. The relationship, the growing importance of the relationship between West Africa, particularly because it's such a resource-rich region, and China and India, has been described by Rita Abramson as flexigemony. And I think the point about that phrase is you're looking at the economic power of those 2 hyper economies in Asia, and the influence that will give them without, in terms of the normal trade relationship, in terms of commercial weight. What is really interesting is that when you get an economy in Africa that says, actually, we're not accepting that, and you've got it, those of you who know about Angola will remember that the Chinese National Oil Company wanted to build a refinery in Lobito, got quite a way down the project, put it together, and then the Angolan government just turned around and said, that's not acceptable, that's not our specification, that's not what we want, end it. And despite having done all this work, the Chinese state oil company just had to finish and pull out. And I think you've got a sense that when the big powers in Asia are confronted with a political obstacle, they tend to back off. They don't want to get into this argument that they're just sort of the new West, that they're coming in and they're just repeating the old colonial relationship of the 19th century, where they come in, they grab the raw materials and get out, and that's it. There is a real effort, so if you like, a propaganda effort, whatever you want to call it, a diplomatic effort to say, well, they're different because they have seen what it takes to develop economies very quickly from third world positions into modern industrializing economies, and that's was very much the message coming to BRICS, and it's something that you see in the discourse from officials in Nigeria and Ghana in particular, when they feel that some of the big Asian economies have overstepped the mark. They back off pretty quickly. There are some examples there. You've got the way that successive Nigerian governments, for various reasons, have cancelled South Korean, Indian, Chinese mining licenses. Ghana has been getting quite tough, a crackdown on the illegal Chinese miners, and so on. And I think what the benefit that the West African governments are taking out of this is that we've now got a much more open economy, a much more competitive global economy. So this is a bit like the old Cold War days, yet we're not. It's not an ideological decision. It's a sort of it's a commercial opportunity. But the upshot of it is that if you own the resources and you want to develop the resources, and you need to access the finance, you've got a much broader range of opportunities to choose from. And back to the $4.4 trillion currency reserves, or the 50% that China controls, you've got some very willing financiers there to come in with what appear to be quite attractive terms at the moment. I think the point I'm making here is really the core problems for the resource-rich countries, and particularly clear in Nigeria, if any of you know the Niger Delta, but it's also the case in the oil-producing areas of Liberia and Sierra Leone and Guinea-Conakry and Mauritania. You've got poor environmental and labor regulations. You've got, in all those countries, weak efforts to curb the grand corruption, mispricing schemes and tax avoidance schemes and so on. And then you've got, in each of those areas, but particularly in the Niger Delta, the big political issue is the people in the resource rich areas, what they're getting out of it. and what we've seen in the last 20 years, very importantly, is this rebellion among peoples in the Niger Delta, and it's become a kind of, if you like, an inspiration to other people. So you've got people from the Niger Delta going over to Western Ghana and Takoradi talking about their experience, which I think has concentrated the minds of the Ghana government to try to bring in these, its own mechanisms for resort, some sort of dispute regulation and so on, and conflict resolution, because there's a real concern that just as you see the dynamics of the Niger Delta conflict, the competition on the ground is could be replicated in right along the West African coast. The other BRICS members, Brazil and Russia, we hear less about their African investment, but Brazil's Petrobras has been in Nigeria for many years, since the 1980s, had a very strong counter-trade program in the 1980s, and when Brazil's own oil industry was far less developed than it is now, and became a very important partner for Nigeria. The other big news in West Africa is Vale's stake in Guinea-Conakry's Simandu oil mine, and that of course has become the source of much controversy. They used a South African Israeli middleman by the name of Benny Steinmetz. Some of you may have come across him. His officials have now been arrested in Conakry, and he appealed to Tony Blair the other day to try and get them out of the cooler. They're accused of grand corruption, having bribed the fourth wife of the former military leader, Lansana Conté, about 4 or 5 years ago when Conté was on his deathbed. They got what happened, and I think it's a good example of how these deals are done. They got the Conté government to cancel Rio Tinto's rights to Simandu. Simandu's the biggest iron ore in the mine. It's in four blocks, if you like. So they cancelled Rio Tinto's rights to Block 1 and Block 2. And then there was a bit of a pause. They said that Rio Tinto was just sitting on the asset, wasn't developing it, just waiting for its stock price to go up, and then it would take a look. And you know what Guinea wanted was rapid development of this ore mine. So they cancelled the Rio Tinto license, and then just before Conté died, literally, it was the license to exploit blocks 1 and 2 was handed to Steinmetz, who then on-sold to Vale for a very substantial sum, alleged to be close to $500 million, and got a fairly substantial down payment from Vale meanwhile. So it's obviously Rio's contention that the whole deal was illegal. Conté's wife took a big bribe from Steinmetz, was responsible, and that's now turned into a court case in the US, where you've got Steinmetz's agent in Conakry now up before the Florida courts. Conté's wife now turned state witness in the States, was wired for sound, and had an encounter with this guy, and he asked to destroy a lot of evidence. So it's quite an interesting case. It also gives you an idea of some of the reputational risks around these big deals, and you think something that was done 10 years ago isn't going to come back and bite you. It can quite easily. And that one's going to drag on and on, I'd say. The other, Russia too, is involved in Guinea. You've got Oleg Deripaska's Rusal was trying to get extremely close to the former military government in Guinea. He's now come back, and he's trying to woo the new president of Guinea, or newish president of Guinea, Alpha Condé. And again, by all accounts, it seems Vladimir Putin is interested in extending Russia's influence in Africa, pushing very much his trademark interest in gas pipelines. spent much time trying to persuade the Nigerians what they really need is not LNG, but a pipeline across the Sahara Desert built by Gazprom and operated by Algeria. A lot of Nigerians are a bit skeptical about that, but that's been another Russian play in Africa, and again worth watching because it is part of this new network with Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So you've got all these deals being discussed in a forum that pretty much excludes Europe and America, and I think it's very, very important shift in when you're looking forward now to how this region is going to develop. Europe, I think, is going to have to try and come back into the field and try and find what it has to offer as these big deals are being discussed and these very large resources are being handed over to new companies for exploitation. Just a sort of, I suppose, a cautionary note on all this. The current, if you do an inventory right now in West Africa, and you look at the oil, gas, and mining assets, you still see the dominance of the big oil companies, the Seven Sisters, as they used to be, and ditto with the mining companies. You've got Rio's certainly very well established, Anglo Gold, and so on. So what is happening is that gradually these licenses are being reviewed and the laws are being changed, and particularly the Chinese companies, particularly Sinopec and Sinuk, are coming in and offering deals, some form of counter-trade deals and some elaborate form of joint financing deals and resource offtake deals, but essentially it gives China access to the resources that they need in exchange for building infrastructure. And the big story about West Africa, as is in the rest of Africa at the moment, is can the infrastructure be built fast enough to really take advantage of this economic rise? And to give you an idea of the conundrum that faces African leaders, the World Bank and the African Development Bank have done their own research into this, and their calculation is that Africa has to invest at least $90 billion a year in infrastructure. Now, before the 2008 financial crash in the West, the African Development Bank and the World Bank put together a plan where they could raise about $45 billion, about half of what's required, through various means, through the bank, the World Bank, the European Development Bank or European Investment Bank, and the African Development Bank, and various other institutions, plus the Chinese Development Bank, and so on. That was then. This year, they're barely up to half of that. So there is a real urgent need to pull that infrastructure financing together, which is going to be critical to developing those resources in the region. So despite the huge demand and despite those pretty impressive growth figures you're seeing across Africa, average of over 6% over the past decade, and in the resource-rich countries often 7 to 8%, that can only be sustained if there's that investment in the infrastructure to make it possible, A, to extract the resources, and most importantly, politically and socially, to process the resources and add value, and begin to build up competitive, viable manufacturing industries in the region. And that's all going to require that infrastructure investment. And even with China's own current economic weight, that money isn't there. So that makes these sort of resource counter-trade deals in exchange for infrastructure more and more important in terms when if you talk to any of the government officials in West Africa and their Asian counterparts, they say, you say, well, what was the discussion about? And they say it was about jobs. How can we use these resources to process these resources, not just to get money in the bank? That's not good enough. We've got to get them into industries and productive activities that will give people jobs. That's what we're looking for, and that's a political survival imperative. It's not an optional at the moment, and that's why a lot of this dialogue now between Africa and China is based, particularly between Africa and China, but also between India and China, India and Africa. It's based around what can be done productively together. So, and the Chinese, on their part, are very conscious that they do not want to be seen as the sort of purely the resource extractors. They want a stronger developmental role. The Ghana development plan is also interesting in the sense that Ghana is trying to learn very much from what went on in Nigeria. There's this sort of slogan in Ghana at the moment: are we going to Norway or Nigeria? It's not quite accurate, actually, just even in the sense of the two choices. What Ghana is trying to do is to develop a national development industrial program on the basis of its oil and gas resources. It's less, and you'll see the same thing going on in Tanzania, particularly, and Mozambique to a lesser extent. It's less about just using those like Nigeria did in the 60s and 70s. Pump out the oil, pick up the cash, pump out the oil, pick up the cash, do a few projects on the side, a few downstream things. It's, with Ghana, it's very much, we've got to use the gas for power, we've got to use the downstream for pharmaceuticals, for fertilizer, and so on. So there's a real effort to work out how best to do that. The implementation of it so far has been lagging behind the timetable, but definitely the strategic plan is very much oil and gas are not just an export, or not even mainly an export industry. They're very much the fuel behind local industrial development and also agricultural development. In fact, I mean, if you could build a fertilizer industry in Western Ghana, that's also going to help the country develop its agricultural production too. I'll try and skip through as fast as I can on that. Again, President Obasanjo being very diplomatic there, but I think behind the diplomacy, I think there's a sense, right? You know, come in, bring your money, and let's talk. And I think there's, there are issues there about the way in which the Chinese Asian interest is used as a negotiating tactic. That's quite clearly the case in Nigeria over contracts, terms and royalties. But you're seeing that right across the continent again. Country after country is renegotiating tax terms and royalty terms on the basis that what was the case 10 years ago, 15 years ago is no longer the case. There's much more competition for resources, and you should be able to get in and get better terms for that. Of course, the mining and oil companies say, well, hold on, these are long-term investments, things can change, and so on. So, but there's a much livelier dialogue, and there's much more pushback from the owners and controllers of the resources, particularly the case in West Africa, where you've got Ghana and Nigeria with quite impressive negotiating teams taking on some of the big resource companies. Again, just more examples of infrastructure investment. If you've gone to Lagos recently, you'll see these new metro line projects, and that's if anyone suffered in a Lagos traffic jam, you know the importance of that, and very significant that it's being built by a Chinese company. And by all means, I mean, from what I've seen on the ground, is it's making good progress, and it would be positively revolutionary. It's a bit, I mean, perhaps it's the nearest thing you think about would be maybe the opening of the underground from Baker Street to Farringdon, the middle of the 19th century. That sort of change would be possible. I mean, if you put that kind of infrastructure down in Lagos, it could really change the nature of the city. I mean, quite an important project to get underway. That gives you a sense of the weight of this investment and the varied amount. My colleague at Charles Moret would very knowledgeable about Chinese statistics and so on, and I think he would probably caution a bit of to take these with a bit of a pinch of salt. But the state figures show that it's a very, very diversified investment pattern. It's not all about just pulling out the ore and oil. It's also into services. It's also into manufacturing, and it's very much into building big contracts. Over 50% of the public works contracts now in Africa, probably over 60%, are now awarded straight to Chinese companies, and the big targets there are the big power stations, which, as we all know, there's a shortage of electric power in the world, but particularly in Africa, and there's also a shortage of people to build the big power stations. So, and China's very, very busy in that field. Mentioned about the Zuma and the Good Luck visit, very important. So I think you can see, the importance of this is that South Africa has been pushing for a very much stronger continental role. Because Zuma is now head of the African Union, and they're celebrating the 50th anniversary this month. I think it's very important for to see how that dynamic plays out. But I think the axis between Lagos and axis between Abuja, I should say, and Pretoria is very, very important. Someone said, if tomorrow Nigeria and South Africa declared a free trade zone, what choice would the rest of the continent be offered? You've got two of these mega economies. If they chose to operate and run a free trade zone together, the rest of the countries on the continent, particularly on the west-south axis, would have little option but to join in. So I mean, I think one should see this as part of a kind of a push for continental integration and so on. So it's a very, very important move that you're seeing these discussions between South Africa and Nigeria. It's not to say there's not a lot of issues still to be resolved, boring things like visas and so on, and immigration status. But I think there's now a serious dialogue for reasons of national interest on both sides. President Goodluck Jonathan backed the French intervention in Mali, promised to send in 1,200 ground troops, sent in and 300 Air Force personnel. I don't think they've all arrived, but that quite unprecedented actual support for Nigeria, for a Francophone-led mission, indeed, for a French-led mission, let's be honest. It was quite a change in diplomatic history. For years, in fact, really since 1960, there have been two powers in West Africa, France and Nigeria, and they've been oppositional. France backed Côte d'Ivoire for a long period under the founding president, Houphouët-Boigny. It also backed the breakaway state of Biafra in the Nigerian Civil War, which earned it pretty strong enmity from the Nigerian government at the time. So the fact that Jonathan has cut this deal with President Hollande of France, sent in the troops, and in reciprocation, if you like, Hollande seems to have lent on the authorities in ECOWAS to give the leading role to the Nigerian general Abdul Qadir. And again, that's interesting. The first time a Nigerian general has led a Francophone force. Beyond those diplomatic niceties, of course, I think there are big doubts about where this mission is going. We can talk about that later. There you have central bank governor of Nigeria, is one of the most outspoken central bank governors in the world, I think. He's a journalist's dream, actually, and very, very frank on a number of issues: corruption, good governance, bad governance, and here on the role of China, he's been very clear that the current structure, the current nature of the relationship is not working. China is playing this role of kind of, you know, development partner. Well, it's all very well, but he says they're an economic competitor, and that's how they should be seen. And we've got to sort of take off the rose-tinted spectacles and look at it with a bit more realism. He also is a strong advocate of industrial policy and the need for African governments, again, particularly in the West African region, to get much more serious about adding value, setting up competitive manufacturing operations. The point he makes is rooted in his own analysis of Nigerian economy, where you've got this fairly impressive growth rate of 6.5%, although others would say with those gas and oil resources, gas resources, I think about 5th in the world, oil resources about 7th or 8th in the world, should be doing much, much better still. You've got massive unemployment of 25% nationally, but certainly in the north, much, much higher than that. And that's a very dangerous sign for any government running a country with 160 million people, over whom half are under the age of 20. And again, taking that analysis across the region, you've got the same issues there with all these countries. They've been posting pretty phenomenal growth rates. Ghana 14.4%, Sierra Leone 21%, Niger 14.4%, Liberia 9%. Sure, it's resource related. The macroeconomic management has been much better, but the critical issue is what next? How do you build on that growth and make it sustainable? And that can only be done by adding value to your agricultural production, building the infrastructure to get the goods to market, and investing in processing and manufacturing where you've got a comparative and competitive advantage. If you ever find yourself wading through these reports from the UN or the African Development Bank, they all make this point about the need for Africa, particularly these governments in West Africa, to get very serious about an industrial strategy. And you're beginning to hear that from the opposition parties in West Africa as well. So I'm saying, well, you know, we're not going anywhere under the present policies. We've got to use this wealth in a much more strategic way for the future, because for all sorts of reasons, fracking and all the rest of it, and import substitution and so on, we're not going to. We can't rely on this wealth into the medium term. We've got to diversify. So it's very much the mantra there. Again, in fact, the reality has been across West Africa over the past, I guess, 20 to 30 years, you've actually seen an ebbing away of the manufacturing power. I mean, if countries like Ghana, where Kwame Nkrumah set up many manufacturing industries shortly after independence, using the surplus from agricultural production and cocoa particularly, and some from the gold. Those turned out to be uncompetitive and unsustainable. Ditto Côte d'Ivoire and Nigeria. Their manufacturing sectors were heavily battered during the years of the 70s and 80s in the World Bank and its structural adjustment policies and privatization, liberalization, all the rest of it. So there's now a push for the region to find a more effective and sustainable industrial strategy that works. The latest report by Kofi Annan's African Progress Panel talks a lot about the resource development in West Africa, in particular in West Africa and Central Africa, and I would recommend it to you. It's very well laid out and very clear on the main issues and where the money's going and what needs to be done. And it's part of this, as I said, this growing debate over regulation and accountability in the West. We're having that discussion in the West against a very much more competitive global environment. And you get increasingly strong legislation now coming from the US and from Europe, and an attempt by those regions to engage African governments. I mean, the African activists, civil society, and so on are very, very strongly pushing for accountability. But it's a question of what is the buy-in of the governments themselves. Just a couple of words about agriculture. The dynamic Minister of Agriculture in Nigeria, Akewumi Adesina, has really, I think, started a new green revolution, and I think it's a very credible one. His point is that agriculture has progressively been marginalized with the growth of the oil and gas sector in Nigeria. We've got to get back to that, to use that both as a source of revenues. Nigeria spends $10 billion a year importing rice and wheat, both of which can be grown locally. So Adesina is trying to put in a credible system of extension services. They've produced a system, actually, quite interestingly, which allow farmers to access subsidized fertilizer by cell phone and things like that. So there's a lot of innovations to avoid some of the crookery that's that's held these agricultural development programs back. Data manufacturing, right. Same thing's happening in Ghana. You've got this great sort of boom in local rice production in Ghana. It's quite interesting, and a push both in Ghana and in Côte d'Ivoire to get more value out of cocoa, to make the sort of to make the most out of this new sort of designer cocoa industry that seems to be, or designer chocolate industry that seems to be coming up, and so on. So you see a much more sort of market savvy leadership there. Both in terms of the agriculture and other sectors. Nigeria is being held back absolutely chronically by the electric power. And to give you an idea of the crisis, and if you've spent any time, I lived in Lagos for a decade. If you spent any time in Lagos, you would know just how frustrating that is. South Africa, with 50 million people, generates 45,000 megawatts. Nigeria has about 170 million people, and on a good day generates 4,500 megawatts. So you've got in stark terms, you've got the difference between the electric power generation there and what's really holding Nigeria back in terms of basic infrastructure. Again, and that's something across the power. I mean, even in Ghana, which has won all these plaudits for economic management and political change and political openness, we've got a current big economic crisis caused by the stoppages of power and water in Accra. So this pattern of rapid economic change, rapid economic growth, and demographic growth, with the infrastructure struggling to catch up, is hitting quite hard. I'm just going to sort of rush through a few political points about Nigeria. You've got and then we can get into some questions, I hope. National Electric Power Authority is effectively being privatized. 14 bidders for the new 15 private companies have come in, and they met their deadlines. They paid up. Already, they paid up $500 million, and they're expecting another $1.5 billion out of this. These power companies include among their number some of the old diesel barons, people like Ouattara and Co. People would say, well, these are the people who made money out of Nigeria not having power, so why are they coming in at this stage to run power stations? Because the failure of the power sector in Nigeria was hugely profitable to certain members of the elite. Well, I guess the way that was explained to me by a Nigerian official in Abuja was like, it's a bit like the old Indonesian system. The robber barons have finally realized that actually if they keep the money in the country, they can make even more of it. So you might think that sort of the Indonesian type system coming to Nigeria will be a positive thing, and it's very much under test, if you like, in this privatization of the electricity sector in Nigeria. And if it delivers, it does change the way in which Jonathan's perceived. He would be perceived as someone who's actually achieved something, but he's got effectively 2 years to do it, so he's under a lot of pressure. Again, I'd say if we're talking about corruption in the Nigerian electricity sector, it's 100 times more in the oil and gas. And a good read, if you're interested in these things, would be the report by the former anti-corruption czar, chair of the Economic Financial Crimes Commission, Nuhu Rabadu, who put out a hefty report last year and found that as much as $100 billion had been siphoned out of the oil and gas sector over the past decade. That's pretty staggering. Even fairly conservative economists in institutions such as the World Bank reckon that every year $10 billion goes out of the sector, and I have to say that within Nigeria, no officials have been held to account. Certainly, no senior officials have been held to account. The only big case has been an external one. There's been the U.S. Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Under that act, and they investigated the legendary gas project run by Halliburton and Technip and Snabrojetti and Japanese Gas Corporation, and investigated it and found out that there was huge corruption. The contracts had been overpriced to the level of 10 to 15% over international competitive market rates, and fined Halliburton, Snabrojetti and Technip and Japanese Gas Corporation $2 billion. Nice work for the US Treasury. Nigeria launched its own case against Dick Cheney and got a 30 million hush money, which where that went, I don't know, but some people say it went into the last election campaign. So, sordid tale of corruption, and again, the information's there. Talk to people like Nuhu Rabadu and all the other Nigerian band of economists and analysts, and they'll tell you just how serious it is and how little is being done about it at the moment. So a major political issue there. And there's another NNPC deal in the Netherlands with a company called Vitol, and we could talk about that later. We've mentioned the gas company, right? So it just goes on and on. The other thing about the oil theft and bunkering, to know, some of the oil companies say it's as much as 470,000 barrels a day out of the NNPC's claimed production of 2.7 million. So that would be part of that 10 billion figure we're losing. Very happy to talk in detail about these things. I just wanted then just to flag a few things about, we've got, in the terms of local politics, we've got elections. We're midway through in Nigeria at the moment. Elections coming up in 2014. President Jonathan faces pretty strong opposition from two fronts. From his own party, there are leaders in the north, such as Sule Lamido and Aliyu Babangida and so on, who want to oust him, and they want to be the presidential candidate of the ruling People's Democratic Party in the 2014 elections. And also there's this new opposition formation which combines the Action Congress of Nigeria, which controls most of southwestern Nigeria, and the Congress for Progressive Change, which is very strong in the north. And they've now joined forces, and they're putting together, for the first time in the sort of current dispensation in Nigeria, a united opposition front with national spread. So I think it makes for the possibility of a much more competitive electoral race in 2014. Again, two rumbling security crises, Niger Delta and the North. The Niger Delta crisis, as I said, dates back to the 90s. The northern-dominated crisis is completely different and not amenable to the same tactics that were used. I mean, the Niger Delta, there was an amnesty program, and there were buy-offs to the local politicians. Much harder to do that in the north because it's much closer to the sort of insurgency we've seen in Central Asia. The jihadist groups, heavily funded by Saudi Arabia and Pakistan in the 70s and 80s, have now achieved quite a strong military presence. And the current fighting you're seeing in the north gives an indication of that. Last week, three states declared states of emergency. Government just declared a state of emergency in 3 states, and now in Borno State, in this safari park just south of the capital, Maiduguri, there's essentially a kind of a shooting war going on between the Nigerian army and the Boko Haram jihadist groups. So I think that whatever one's looking at from the state of emergency, it may be that they will win some tactical victories. But I think the critical point about the nature of the politics in the north is the socio-economic factors are not being addressed. That is the lack of jobs, the educational crisis. The schools and the universities are not accommodating the needs of the people, and now there's a real sort of disaffection. And perhaps the major point about this is that it's not in the Niger Delta. It was a conflict between the elites about how to run things. In northern Nigeria, it's now a conflict between the traditional northern elites and the insurgents and the jihadists, who have no time for any of them. They believe that the Sultan of Sokoto and people like the National Security Advisor Samba Dasuki, they're apostates, and people like Goodluck Jonathan are just infidels. So there's a complete polarization, and the danger is at the moment that people in northern Nigeria are living in that zone, in that gap of expectations between the two. A very, very dangerous situation. So on that slightly apocalyptic note, I'll end there. There's a lot more to talk about Mali and Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire and so on. So probably best to now go to questions,
Okay.
so we can get it going.
But would like to ask the first question. Over there, yes.
Well, I think there is increasing criticism of President Ouattara's management of that process and the cajoling of his government by the international community and even, it seems, by certain French officials. So I think there's a real concern that the violent axis is far from over in Côte d'Ivoire. Of course, Guillaume Soro, the former Prime Minister, many people in Côte d'Ivoire believe he should be sitting in a cell in the International Criminal Court alongside Laurent Gbagbo. Nothing's being done of that, and it's said nothing's being done because President Ouattara cannot afford to lose his support. So I think the danger, the real threat to that process is the threat of political disintegration in his coalition, particularly the links with the PDC and so on. So I think he's in a very difficult position. And his announcement that he's going to stand for another term, again, I don't see how that really helps matters. So far from, he's certainly an impressive technocrat, there's no question about that. Former deputy head of the IMF and so on, and he has brought the investment in. But I think there are big questions about what that's achieved and the spread of that investment. I was talking to an Ivorian friend the other day in Paris, and he said he was just amazed that French companies just were walking in. He said it was like the 60s, just walking out and picking up contracts, no bid contracts. The other companies there, both Asian and other Western companies, were sort of goggle-eyed in amazement. So I think that sort of perception, and this is by a guy who basically has been working with Ouattara, if that continues, I think it's going to become extremely unpopular. And the wildest stories I've heard recently have been some sort of axis between the supporters of Solo and the supporters of Gbagbo, that they're actually saying, well, the Kenyans have shown the way forward. If you're both accused of mass murder, you're both at the ICC, team up, and let's have a nationalist card here. So you may well find, and bizarre as it may be, you may find the FPE going into business with Guillaume Soro and putting a nationalist card and saying, end to sort of an attempt to recolonize Côte d'Ivoire by France and end to the ICC. So I foresee quite a bumpy ride ahead in Côte d'Ivoire, and I don't think President Ouattara really has the political skills to handle that. Doesn't seem to have. He's a brilliant economist, no question about that, but he doesn't seem to have the political nous and the credibility to fix that.
Gary Bush. A question which derives from that is that there's some concern about a major change which is likely to happen in West Africa when the Francophone countries want their money back. At the moment, 85% of their foreign reserves are held in France by the French Treasury in their own name, and they've already been hypothecated for the French position in defending the euro.
Right.
So what happens when they want their money back? How are they going to actually contribute to the self-development when these funds are effectively frozen and already hypothecated for the French defense in the European economy?
I think that's a critical question. I've been to a bunch of meetings in the last few weeks. It's the sort of conference season on Africa, the World Economic Forum in Cape Town, something in New York. And there's two issues that come across again and again. We've got this crisis in funding infrastructure development in Africa. So what have we got that we can use? We've got $1 trillion of foreign reserves. We've got about $200 billion easily of pension funds readily available. When we do our deals with the IMF and the World Bank, we sign these complex contracts which say don't touch the foreign reserve. They've got to be in OECD countries. Increasingly, African governments are going back to the IMF and World Bank and say we need the money. Sweden doesn't actually need this money to build railway lines. We do, and I think you're going to see that demand coming from the Francophone states increasingly so. Good old Senegal with its multi-party system and all that. I think the Senegalese sentiment is just as strongly for that as it is among nationalists in Côte d'Ivoire and so on. So I think you're dead right. I think you're going to see major new strains in the CFA system, the French, which is the French-backed currency zone. I think under strains for a two-track approach, because the currency, the exchange rates don't make sense right across the zone for a start. And also, again, it goes back to this sort of Europe-Africa relationship, Africa-Asia relationship. I don't think the French get it. I think they're still, a lot of their policymakers are still in the 60s and 70s. And I think a crisis is brewing, dead right. Well, most of the inward investment in Mali at the moment is in the southern part of the country, and there is. I was speaking to the councillor to the president a couple of weeks ago, and he was proudly, reading off a list of new investments. So there's money coming in, but it's all in the south. And the south, if you go to Bamako today, despite most of the Western countries have got a blanket travel ban on going to Mali, the south is. Bamako's a bit like Surbiton at the moment. So, nice place to go for a holiday, great music too. So, yeah, the north is true. I went up to Mopti and a little bit beyond, and it does get a bit hairy. There's no question about that, and that's not going to change. The French intervention has been very cleverly managed. They kept people like me, journalists, away from the action, so we don't see what's going on. But a lot of it looks pretty bad. The stuff I have seen and the stuff my colleagues have seen looks pretty bad. It's by no means over, particularly in Gao, which, as you know, the triangle of places, Gao, Timbuktu, and Kidal. The problem in Gao is that Gao is much more supportive of the jihadist cause. They weren't actually kicked out of Gao, they just went underground and so on. So trouble is brewing in Gao. There have been a number of car bombs and so on, and suicide bombers, and I don't think that's settled. The Kidal thing is another dimension altogether, because the Tuareg groups are very reluctant to move out of Kidal and hand it over to the National Malian Army, and they don't seem to have sorted that out. And there's a lot of antipathy, obviously, between the Tuareg groups and the Malian Army about how that can be done. The complicating factor is now that France is pushing for these elections by the end of July. and no one really knows what these elections are going to prove. If anything, I mean, if you can really have an election in northern Mali under those conditions, you can have an election in southern Mali. And one of the alarming things, if you talk to people like Diable Dramé, the former foreign minister, say that, you know, it seems like we've gone through sort of World War II and we haven't taken any lessons from it at all. We're not changing our politics at all. We're not changing the structure, the representation of, we're not looking at the political system that gave rise to this criminalization in the north. So in other words, we're just sort of pretending the last 10 years didn't happen and we're just going to have a new set of elections, hoping that's going to fix it. And, you know, elections are not really bringing anything to Malians. So I'm not terribly optimistic, I have to say.
Yeah. Just a question about the withdrawal of the Chadian forces from Mali. Was that because they had taken the brunt and were doing the majority of the heavy lifting on behalf of the French and everything else?
Yeah.
Or was it because Déby is potentially renegotiating his relationship with Paris?
Oh, I think very much the latter. And you know, it's a big story actually. The front page of Le Monde a couple of days ago. He wants Chadian troops to walk down the Champs-Élysées on Bastille Day. Great, you know, they bailed the French out. They helped run after the jihadists, and they took much heavier losses, obviously, than the French troops in the north. The only slight problem there is that for the last 2 or 3 weeks, he's been arresting journalists, human rights activists, anyone who's, you know, has any remotely dissident opinions in N'Djamena. He's, you know, it's back to sort of Déby I, a very autocratic, intolerant military leader, and he's sort of challenging France to say, oh, come and criticize me now. I've bailed you out in Mali. What are you going to say? And Hollande has come out with the blandest of blandishments. Oh well, we have our principles, and they apply to everyone, including Chad. And they're not actually saying how those principles will apply to Chad. I wouldn't be at all surprised to see Chadian troops march down the Champs-Élysées month after next, and indeed Déby get his state visit and handshake in front of France 24 with Hollande. Hollande knows him a lot. If the Chadian troops hadn't gone in, they were by far the best equipped and the bravest. I think the French expedition would have hit a lot more problems. So he's bought that, just as the way that Kenyatta's bought some time over Somalia and the ICC. Déby's taken a leaf out of that playbook and used it against the French, I think. Sorry.
A question on some growing piracy that we've seen in the West African region, especially in the Gulf of Guinea, and we've seen much more hijacking recently.
Yes. Maritime. Yeah. I mean, the International Crisis Group did a big reporting at the beginning of the year, and they said it's actually now worse in the Gulf of Guinea than it was 10 years ago, which again is it might be slightly unfair that the Niger Delta groups get much of the blame for that, but I just don't know how unfair it is. They're certainly part of it, and I think what seems to happen was they got squeezed out of the core business around the Niger Delta, so then they went further out to sea. What's quite interesting is the nature of those heists, and they're obviously getting very good intelligence about the times and the sailings of the big tankers, how heavily armed they are, if there's going to be any resistance, and so on. So it's quite an organized trade, and I would say it sort of folds into the bunkering trade in general. You know, the whatever 450,000 barrels a day that the oil companies say is missing from bunkering and oil theft. So it goes into that illegality. I see that the Ghana Navy has been bigged up recently. Ditto with the Nigerian Navy that's been buying ships. It seems, yeah, I mean, it seems to be an increasing problem. But again, I think just like the internal politics of the Niger Delta, there's a lot of institutional questions that have to be asked. You know, how are these people getting this intelligence about the sailings of these ships? And why is it that the Coast Guard are so unimpressive and don't act when they're meant to act, and so on? So I think it is a worrying thing. But I think, unlike, for example, the hijackings in the Indian Ocean and up by the Red Sea, I think it's not about some external insurgent group. I think it's about a pretty clever criminal conspiracy using institutional links with regional governments or officials in regional governments.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, Ghana is bidding very hard to become this sort of oil and gas logistics center in West Africa on the basis that it's easier to operate in Ghana than it is in Nigeria, and they're certainly putting a lot of investment into that. Then you've got this cross-border cooperation between Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire over the gas resources, which has hit a few rocks over maritime boundaries and so on. But I think that I think that's quite a possibility. The other big issue is refining capacity, and where is that going to be based? I mean, Nigeria is talking about letting out these new contracts for new refineries and so on. Is that going to be for the whole of West Africa? I mean, it would make sense if it was, but it seems the new trend is for smaller refineries, and going back to the old sort of airline and flag idea of an oil refinery. Everyone should have one. So in other words, yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of ideas. It's ECOWAS, yeah, I mean, it should be because of the name of it. It's the economic community. I think in tandem, the trouble is that ECOWAS doesn't have the fundraising powers. I mean, it needs to get in there with the African Development Bank and so on. But I think, I mean, I've seen quite a lot of, self-questioning about ECOWAS recently, and they've been saying, look, look at the East African community. They've moved on. They came much later to the game than we've done. I mean, I saw actually Obasanjo the other day, and he said, I don't know what happened. We started ECOWAS 40 years ago. Nothing's happened since I left, sort of thing. So I think there's a lot of discontent in just how effective an organisation it is compared to SADC and EAC.